好，谢谢大家来参加我们这个演讲哈。我是魏轩的，然后这我旁边是我同事邱凡元，我是从多伦多来，他是旧金山来的。那今天我们等一下可能会用英文讲，可是后面会有中文字幕，所以不用担心。然后等一下有问题的话，也可以用中文问，OK？好，来开始吧。所以很快介绍一下，我刚刚说我叫 Matt 或宣德，台北出生，然后小时候移民到加拿大，到温哥华，然后现在在多伦多工作跟在那边工作。然后呢，我的背景事实上跟我住的地方都有一点相似，就是因为住了很多地方嘛，我工作也做了一大堆不同的东西，从加拿大联邦政府到那个 FedEx，还有做一些就是保险、金融，还有健康保险，跟那个加拿大一个省份的健康局，还有一些其他的不同的项目。
OK，大家好，我是邱凡人，我的英文名字是 Wesley，我也是台湾人，不过我在纽约出生，在南加州长大。OK，我要换到英文。Hello everyone. Okay, so I started my tech career in, you guessed it, the world largest see in the entire world in terms of people and money, the United States Air Force. Didn't guess that, did you? Hmm? Ooh,
哦，等一下我
of
们再
course. The mouse goes off that way. Yeah.
继续讲。
Okay, so while I was in the US Air Force, though, I helped co found a lot of movements across the Air Force to modernize the mission critical software that my fellow service members pin their lives on every day. And of course, we didn't do that alone, though. We had the help of some world class consultants from Pivotal Labs, now called VMware Tanzu Labs. So, for those of you who don't know what Tanzu Labs is, I'll explain really quick just how big an impact that they and their practices have had on me and the US Air Force. So think of labs as your personal trainer to catalyze your digital transformation through software, whether it's by helping you, one, deliver that software faster, and or two, operate modern infrastructure to support that software. So every consulting firm will say the same exact thing, but in my experience, having been a labs client while I was in the Air Force myself, what makes labs shine is how we don't just create software or give you some training and then we just say goodbye. We do a lot more than that. When I was a labs client, a labs consultant like Matt paired with me and each individual person in my Air Force team, and we built the software together. We solved the problem together, and we did all the work, and they coached us along the way. And I learned by doing the whole time. So by the end of this engagement, we not only had a working product, but also an organization that could carry on and independently. So, and that is why I now work for Tanzu Labs myself, so I can pay it forward to the next person. So before we begin, let's talk about the goals of this talk. We want to share some other practices that we've learned and incorporated into Tanzu Labs' core practices. And we want to share those practices with you so you're enabled to reap the full benefits of modern product development. So our hope is that you'll leave this talk with some more tools at your disposal so you can get to work. Okay.
All right, thanks, Wes. All right, so when we work with customers or our clients on domain-driven design, there's three things they always tell us they have problems with. Number one, we have too many different stakeholders. We have different managers, directors. They all have different ways to define our domains. The definitions are different. We never agree on anything. Number two, it takes way too long to deliver anything into production. It takes sometimes us months, years before we see anything. So what's the point of doing all these domain-driven design if we're not going to be able to see it? And then number three, we don't have any users. A lot of times we go in and they say, we don't have users. We have systems, we have services, we have APIs. Why do we care about users? So we'll talk through those three problems and how we solve for them. The very first one here, like we have different people that disagree on domains, definitions, aggregates, subdomains. And a lot of times it feels like this, right? One person says they're right, the other one says, I'm right too. And that's okay. Everyone has a different background. They have different experiences. They have different ways to think about how the business runs. And what's important here is that you take the diversity of those opinions to create the best possible solution in service of the product, not to prove that you're right, but make sure that the product is right. And what do we mean by that? Well, we need to form a team, right? Everyone here works in a team, yes? You all have a team? So for us, a successful team is a balanced team. And for us, a balanced team usually includes 3 different areas. Number 1, product management, like myself. Then you have engineering and design. So as a product manager, what I'm going to be concerned about is how do I make sure that this is viable for the business? I will be leading different activities, such as what's the product vision? What are the product goals? What's our outcome and our metric to know that we're succeeding? And it's not that I am setting these things. I'm working with the engineers to see what's viable. I'm working with designers to see what's actually desirable. What do the users want? Designers, on the other hand, they're the ones that are concerned about, okay, is this something that the users would want to use? Is this actually going to be useful? Now, in a domain-driven design system, your user could be your machines or your services. It could also be your developers. How would a developer best and most easily access the data? How would they want to interact with my API here? What are the things they're going to call? What do they expect in response? And then the engineers, on the other hand, they're thinking, how do I actually make software to fulfill the business needs and fulfill the desirability needs? And they will be leading things such as, okay, we might be doing event store. We might do system design architecture diagrams. We might be talking about our site reliability engineering metrics, like your DORA metrics, or maybe your non-functional requirements, right? Those are the things that's going to lay the foundations to make sure that you are able to support the business and the user. Now, what it is not, however, is this, and we see this a lot, right? We have the product control freak, a product manager that comes in and says, I'm the CEO, I make the decisions, you listen to me. I say you do A, you do A. That is not the right way to do it. You also have a designer who usually comes in and is like, I don't care what the PM says because I'm the one who talks to the user. I'm the designer. I know everything. The user says this. I don't care if the PM says the business needs this. The user says this, so we're going to do it this way. And then as engineers, how many software developers do we have or architects? Show of hands. How many times do you feel like you're just a factory, a software factory for them, right? You're just a little machine. They say build this, they press a button and you start coding. Right? You don't want that. This is not a picture of a balanced team or a healthy team. This is a picture of a dysfunctional team. So you might be asking, okay, great. How do we change that, right? This is really hard to change. So your team might be a little bit different. You may have, instead of product engineer and design, you may be like, say, an architect, and you might be working with someone from operations or your support team that supports the product internally. And you might have someone in marketing. What you want to remember here is the principle of what we're saying here is whatever your team composition is, your job is not to be right. Your job is to make sure that the product, which sits at the center, at the intersection of all the different functions, is going to be successful. And that needs to be evidence-based. So let's say, for example, maybe marketing comes in and says, okay, here's the market landscape. This is what the market says they need. They may then tell the architects, this is what the market data is telling us. How does that impact your architectural design? How does that affect how you define your domains? The architect may say, okay, well, if that's the case, I may need to change my subdomain here to have a different contract. Or maybe I need to change the aggregate to include another subdomain. Maybe that's the case. And that would impact how architecture thinks about the system design. And then they would then go back to, say, your operations or support team and say, hey, we're making these changes in our design. Here are some impact that you should expect in case someone calls in or sends a ticket, says, hey, I'm having problems with the software. Can you help me? Right? And then support and operations, they don't just say, yes, sir, we will do that. They may say, okay, that's okay, we can support it, but here's the impact to our customer satisfaction, our customer retention, if they become frustrated. And then that will also loop back to marketing to tell them, hey, this is a potential impact. So that is when the 3 different areas or functions within your organization has to come together and figure out, okay, if that's the impact, is this worth it for us to make that kind of decision, to make the change to our service design and fulfill that market need? Or do we need to reorganize our business a little bit to figure out how do we best support that market need, if it's or is it even something we need to pursue, right? Not everything, even if the market says they want it, doesn't mean you as a business have to go fulfill it. That's something you need to have a discussion about. And that's where I would encourage you to start having that conversation.
All right, thanks, Matt. So the next thing we want to talk about is the problem of taking too long to deliver anything to production. So in the more traditional methods of software or product development, you have companies practicing what we call big bang releases. That is, the organization takes a long concerted effort to build a huge portion of the product, if not the whole thing all at once. So it spends all this time exhaustively doing the research, planning the resources out, building the code, making a plan, and then doing the sweeping coding review, finally compliance checks, and finally, after all this long marathon, we're going to go out with a big bang, build it all out at once. Now, the problem with these big bang releases is that you have long release time. Interesting. You have blue screens of death. Give me 1 second. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Let me see here. Oh, dang. All this real quick. Okay.
稍等一下。
Oh, okay. Give me 1 second. And then let's see. I'm gonna take this back.
Other side.
Other side?
Yeah.
There we go. Are we still screen sharing here? Okay, let me do this. Yeah.
那边有吗？
My goodness gracious. Okay. All right. And is the Zoom still seeing it? Okay. All right. Where was I? Thank you for holding. Okay. So the problem with these big bang releases is that you have long release timelines. And long release timelines means you have a long feedback loop. Now, what we mean by long feedback loop, a feedback loop is seeing how what we build performs in the real world environment with the real world users. So during these long release timelines, you spend months and months and months, if not years, doing your best work to make this big bang release happen. And all the while, your users don't actually experience what you build until the very, very end, 11 months later. So what can possibly go wrong? Well, a lot actually, because there's a lot of risk here. So while building these big bang releases, you're not having your real world users use what you build in the real world environment. So with that, you're not validating that what you build is actually going to work or is going to add value to those users. And the longer you don't validate, the greater the risk that all your efforts these past several months or years was a total waste. And so from our points of view as Tanzu Labs product managers, is that we want to keep that risk low. And to do that, we build small, thin slices of the product and immediately push those slices to production and get real world feedback from the real world environment as soon as possible. And what that does in practicality is that you build something and you get it into your real users' hands, you measure how well it performs, and then you use the learnings that we gain to inform us on what to do next. It's like a science experiment, if you think about it that way. You have your hypothesis, you have your controls, then you have your independent variable that you're changing and testing to see if that change makes your software any better. So one may say that, hey, we are doing that. We're doing build, measure, learn just across 11 months. Not so bad, right? But it's so much easier to test a small 1 to 2 week experiment in a thin slice with just like 1 or 2 independent variables, rather than a several months long behemoth with dozens, if not hundreds of independent variables. Because what if something went wrong? and you have to examine those dozens of independent variables. It's going to be really hard to diagnose where we went wrong, what we could have done better, how far we need to backtrack. And as someone who used to be a dev myself, I'm going to feel like crap because those 11 months, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've wasted all of this blood, sweat, and tears being told I'm a code factory and I have to just erase everything. Everyone's just going to feel crummy after that. Okay. So you might have heard me say thin slice. Now, what do I mean by that? So let's look at this image. Imagine this cake as your product. And imagine your product is an online store. So traditional methods tell us to build a product in horizontal layers. Now, build the whole product backend first, then add the security controls, other things like that, and finally the UI in the very, very top. That's all well and good, but the whole time you're building these layers, the users can't get any value from the hard work that you and your team have put in until the web UI layer is built. And that's risky because if we wait for months and months to build all this backend stuff, and then we finally validate that our work is valuable to our users, there's a risk that we might have done something wrong along the way, and we might need to just redo the entire bottom layers all over again. And again, everyone's just going to feel crummy. There's a lot of wasted time and effort. So instead of building horizontal layers, we recommend building vertical slices instead. So let's say, for example, paying to order with a credit card. Instead of trying to build the entire product all at once, you just want to build a feature of being able to pay with a credit card. You build the backend, the security layers, and the web UI for just that, and you get it out to users' hands, and you see how well it performs. And if it doesn't perform well, that's fine. We lost maybe a couple weeks of work. We can no harm, no foul. But if it does, then we can move on to the next vertical slice. And the whole time, your company is benefiting from the revenue of your users using their credit card to pay the entire way. And you're also getting that market share because now you have users using your product the entire way. And they're seeing your good work constantly. Okay. Now, of course, not everyone has the luxury of working with human users. Sometimes the products interface with services or systems. Let's talk about that. So regardless if your users are human or services, Labs utilizes this practice called user-centered design, or UCD. What is UCD? Here's the definition. But the intention, or the cliff notes, is that we make sure that everything we're doing adds real, tangible value to the people using the product or the services using the product. Remember these CV remotes back from the old days? So many buttons. How many of them do you actually use day to day? How many of you have done this to that remote? Maybe for someone you know. So turns out most of the time, we just want to change the channel or the volume. The rest of the buttons, while useful sometimes, they were distracting for most users and most of our use case. It's tempting to build those extra buttons and those extra features for those specific use cases. But for most users, it doesn't really apply to them. And if it doesn't apply, those buttons are just distractions. So why spend that additional time, the resources, and the capital to build functionality that either do not get used all the time or make the common everyday use cases more difficult to do? That's just being wasteful with our resources. And then we get people, doing the tape thing. Okay. So in other words, UCD generates user value. How do we do that? Well, we interview our users directly to understand their needs and challenges directly from them. We also directly observe them, so doing their work to see their behaviors as well. So rather than guessing and predicting what they might need, we seek out their inputs directly. And we use those inputs to build a product that actually adds value to them. And when users see how their inputs translate to working software in their hands, they get really excited. They get really bought in. They get invested. And they're excited to give more feedback, and they can't wait to get the next version. And that next version is informed by their feedback, so we know that the next version is going to work rather than guessing lower risk. It's a compounding positive feedback loop.
All right, whoa, but hold on. We don't have users. We have APIs. We have services. This doesn't apply to us, you say. But does it really? Think about it. If you have an API or a service, let's say you have a service. It needs to go call another service or maybe go to a database and fetch data. And then when it comes back with the data, it needs to do some kind of business logic processing with that data to do something that we pre-programmed. And then it's going to have to do something with that data. Maybe it needs to pass it to another service because that service is asking for it. Or maybe it needs to go save it to somewhere else or do something else with it. Doesn't that sound like a user? If you have a human who goes to a web UI, what are they doing? They're most likely entering or retrieving data from some sort of backend or API. And then they're doing some logic either on screen or in their head thinking about, oh, okay, how do I make use of this data? And then I need to pass the results of my data analysis or transformation to either my boss who's asking for it in an email or Excel sheet. I'm sure most of you have done that. Or maybe I need to print it off, or I need to go save that data to another place. Don't those two sound similar? So what we're saying here is, your APIs and services, you can think of them as your users. They do very similar things. It's just one is a human and one is a machine. And we use something called machina personas, just like we use for user persona, where we need to know the needs and the wants and the challenges of that user for using our software. So too, you can think of your APIs and services as having needs, wants, challenges. And let's take an example here, right? 谁有在网络上打麻将的？哎，有，最少一个，太好了。Okay, so think about it this way, right? You have your app, right? Every time you draw, you pick a card, you pick a tile, there's a turn, right? And you need to know what tile that is, what's in your hand. You tell it goes to the coordinator service, whatever you want to call it. That needs to go to the database to see how many tiles do we have left. And it'll come back, tell the coordinator, here's the tiles remaining. It needs to go to an odds calculator to tell you, okay, with this tile, what's your chance of winning or making whatever combo you have in your hand? It'll tell you those odds. The coordinator will then go back to the app here and tell the user, hey, here are your chances. Here are some recommendations on what we would do, right? And so if we look at that and just turn the services into users or the machina personas, you have your app, Kenny the gambler, you have Peter, the project manager as the coordinator service, Tim, the tile whiz, who's your database, and Katie, the calculator, right? Those are all just replacing your service names with human names, but they're still doing the same thing. As the Kenny the Gambler app, the web UI app, right? An iOS app or Android or web, whatever you want. I need to make suggestions for my user who's using me to give them the best chances of winning. My needs here, right? I need to tell them what's the current hand, what's your odds, and they need to make that decision. And then I also need to go get those odds from Katie. Katie's going to give me those odds. My responsibilities, besides talking with the human, I need to also make sure that the information that other players have done is sent to every single user and is also sent to Katie and to the database so that we always have the same contract of here are the tiles, here's the tile remaining, here are the ones that got taken. I also need to make sure every single player knows the odds in their hands. And for the business, I need to make sure I'm earning revenue. Well, if we're earning revenue and we're doing an online app, what my challenge is, number one, how do I make sure that the earnings fall within the law of wherever the player is coming from or where I'm operating in, right? That's just like a person who needs to, like a project manager who may need to think about all these different things. So the short of the story here is that machina personas help us keep clear the needs and the wants of the services in a complex system.
All right, cool. So now that we've gone through all these examples, some of y'all might be wondering, why does this all matter? Cool, there's a lot of really floofy terms and phrases, that's all nice, but what's really at stake here? Well, a lot actually. So let's run by the numbers. So every year, globally, the world spends about $1 trillion on software development. And 150 billion of that is lost because of abandoned projects every single year. So here's a graphic that Forbes made, listing the top reasons why new initiatives or startups fail. So things like, let's see, small, like no market need, getting out competed, ignoring customers, or a failure to pivot. So in the modern age, competition is really stiff. Things change more often and quickly than ever before, and things just aren't so clear cut. But you need to make a decision and get a product out the door. So having a balanced team that practices what we spoke about could have avoided some of these pitfalls. For example, being outcompeted. We could have avoided being outcompeted if we just pushed thin vertical slices out to our users immediately and early and often, and incorporating the real world feedback early on, instead of spending entire 11 months trying to do this big bang release, because 11 months later, what if something went wrong? And then our product just flops. Now we're 11 months behind schedule, and another competitor comes around and steals the market share. Or on top of that, practicing UCD, that user-centered design, that could avoid us ignoring our customers. Because if we took the time to interview them, observe their behaviors, and take their inputs, then we could have understood exactly what they needed, or maybe found out where we were wrong, so we can pivot accordingly and keep those customers' trust and the buy-in into our product. And finally, the product being mistimed, that's another reason why a lot of startups failed. Product mistiming could have been solved by thin vertical slices, because it's very hard to try to predict in a whole 12-month long timeline, but it's much easier to try to schedule out 2-week thin slices instead. Okay, and so, of course, in my experience in the US Air Force, we don't really worry so much about revenue. We're a government organization. For us, while in the Air Force, failure to us is not a loss of subscribers. It's not a loss of revenue. It is a loss of lives. So, for example, the Afghanistan airlift, the US military, it was ending its presence in Afghanistan. And so as a result, we had to evacuate a massive portion of the Afghan civilian population out of the country in a very, very short amount of time. So all of a sudden, the demand for transport aircraft in the area just went straight up through the roof. So inevitably, there was a traffic jam on the tarmac at the airport in the capital. And as you can see here, they were just sitting there, completely vulnerable to attack. It was a humongous traffic jam. And if the enemy really wanted to, they could have just turned this into a complete bloodbath. And all the while, the slower the aircraft were leaving, the fewer Afghan lives were actually being saved. And so the Air Force, we did have a software solution already in place, and it's called Slapshot. What it does is that it generates what we call a master air plan for the US military to schedule what planes need to be where and when. And so it's used to handling a high number of aircraft each and every day, absolutely. But the Afghanistan airlift was the largest airlift in world history by a long shot. So no software could have predicted that huge surge, and let alone even handle it. So as a result, Slapshot was actually crashing. It wasn't able to make those master airplanes to coordinate this ballet of aircraft flying from the United States to Europe, to Africa, to Afghanistan, all the way back. You can't do that over whiteboards or Excel sheets. We've tried it before. It was very bad. It was not a good time. Do not recommend. But within a few hours of that crashing happening, the product team responsible for Slapshot was, it leaned on labs practices that we've taught them to get Slapshot back up and running, and even reduce the load times to build a mass airplane down to just 3 seconds, even that humongous surge. So how did they do that? Well, they did use user-centered design. So they used UCD to fully understand the problem on the ground and to see how processes changed to accommodate that surge. Because in that huge surge, any process that you might have rehearsed or perfected the past 20 years just goes out the door. You have to make changes to accommodate for, like, literally, I think like 200 times as many aircraft that you have to handle. So by understanding how those changes happened, the product team was able to modify that software right away so they can support those procedural changes. Software should be an enabler, not a blocker to the completion of your work. And UCD helped the product team be able to make that software be an enabler, even in the face of that humongous crisis. And then they leverage vertical thin slices. So the first slice that they built was just get laptop alarm crash. Just make sure to build a master air plan. And when you have lives at stake, like every second counts to get Slapshot up and running. And then what they did is that they pushed another thin slice about maybe a day later, where they tweaked the algorithms in small ways. So then the load time went down from 35 seconds to 25 seconds. Then they did it again to bring it down to 10 seconds. And finally, the very last thin slice, 3 seconds. So during the airlift, things were just changing all the time because because no plan ever goes according to plan, especially military ones. And so there's just so much uncertainty going around because, hey, what is the deadline to be out of the country? Do we have a month? Do we have 2 weeks? Are the Taliban planning an attack right now? We're not sure. But the project team had to make a decision to get those planes moving so they're not just sitting on the tarmac. And we needed to get those lives out of there. And so by building thin slices and using the mindset of small experiments and a few independent controls, the US military could get those incremental changes quickly at the speed of relevance and to make the right changes the first time. And by pushing those thin slices, they steadily increased the rate at which the US military was evacuating people from the very beginning. So the first slice, the rate was very, very low, but at least it was running. At least we were getting people out instead of just complete standstill. And then every slice, we were increasing it along the way. So now imagine if we worked on a sweeping solution in a vacuum without user-centered design, and we finally deploy the big bang release at the very end. What if it didn't work? After all those 2 weeks, like all of those Afghan lives would have been waiting on the tarmac, expecting that solution, and we just couldn't deliver. What then? So the impact. On the largest day of the evacuation, the US military evacuated 21,600 people in a single day. Flights were taking off every 45 minutes. And overall, US forces alone evacuated 116,700 people in just a few weeks. That's not including our partners like the French, the British, and the Belgians. And Slapshot and his vertical thin slices and using user-centered design, that all made that happen. We were all able to give those Afghan lives another lease on life and escape Taliban control. So the point I'm trying to make, these principles we're speaking about, they're not just things to say at a campfire. They really are ingredients to mission success and lives saved.
All right, let's take a look how we're not the US military, right? We don't have the kind of money like the US military has. We don't have the kind of manpower. How will we actually make this work in our company? So here's an example system, very simple. I know it's not a complex system like you have at your work, but here is a payments system, right? You have some services like the ingress that's taking data from our legacy IBMI or IDMS system, whatever you have it built on. It's COBOL probably. And then you're probably taking that data, you're saving it into your new microservice or cloud native app. That ingress then saves it. You have your transactions service who's going to call the ingress to say, hey, I need to get this transaction by this ID or this account. You also have a reports service that says, okay, I need to get all the different credit and debit transactions so I can make a report that will get spit out either in Excel or whatever other format. Or maybe our egress service who then needs to take the raw data, right, and say, okay, I need to pass it back to another legacy service that needs to do some kind of auditing, whatever that may be. So here's just example system. We see this a lot. People have these plans. The problem is they go about modernizing this way in a very linear format. They may have built a modern UI first, and then they said, great, that's going to go back into our legacy system, pull the data, and then reflect it on the modern UI. And then while that's happening, they say, okay, let's start building our ingress service. Let's do a one API endpoint at a time. And they would do that, and then all the data still has to be fed back and backfilled into the legacy system, right? So that your company can keep running. And then their plan is to make all the other services and APIs one at a time down the line until everything is finally done. Then they do a big bang release and say, okay, we've modernized every single component, we can go live. That's super risky. How do you know that data will flow in your new system from your modern UI all the way to the very last end? From end to end, you have no idea the entire time you're building your system that real world data is actually going to successfully go through your new system the way you designed it. Because all that entire time you're building every single service, data still flows back into your old system to run through the rest. So you never actually know until the last day when you're ready to release whether or not your data will go through your new system. And usually companies call us somewhere around the 15 months, right? They start, say, March 2022, they have a mandate to finish by December 2025. About a year and a half, they would call us and say, hey, we're here. We're never going to make that deadline. How do you do it? And that's usually where we come in and say, okay, well, here's another plan. What if we do a thin slice? How do we validate? The biggest risk you have when you're modernizing is making sure that the plan or the system design you have actually makes sense. What if we take a thin slice of that and say we run the data from beginning to end? End to end, it goes through, we can validate our system design works. Okay, and then let's expand that, right? We add more thin slices, expand more functionality onto our new system until finally all of your workloads are running on your new system and you can turn off your old system without anyone knowing the difference because they've already been seeing the system run as intended. You don't have to worry about that. So how do we think about thin slices? How do we choose what's going to actually come into the new system first? There's different ways to do it. These aren't all the ways, but here are some examples. User workflows. Like we were talking about, maybe there is a user workflow that has maybe the least impact to your business operations, like your auditing team. They may need to talk to the reports service. And how do we build a system that goes end to end in our modern design for them? And then if that works, how do we expand that? Another way to think about it is your data type. What's the most common data type? Maybe it's in USD. The amounts of US dollar transactions, do it first, and then we do other types of currencies. Or it could be system functionality. Maybe your current system is so old and unstable that you need to make sure that your new system is reliable first. So you make the system run through with mock data end to end, make sure that everything works with 99% uptime or whatever standard you have. And then you start building on the other layers of data type or user workflow. So that's it. We have questions if anyone wants to ask. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. If you are wondering, okay, there's a lot more I want to dig into, contact us with that QR code. We have local partners here that will be able to talk with you. And that is it. Actually, one more thing. Right after this talk, I know this is not very technical heavy. After this talk, we have our colleague from Singapore. He's going to talk to you about test-driven development and extreme programming and how those core practices actually help us make DDD a lot faster. Thank you.可以。对。
过去你们的经验里面，当我们遇到我们的就是不是这样切分的，就是说，你要做一个 vertical slice 的时候，它必须得要跨团队。那过去的经验怎么？这可能是一个很大的问题了。到底像这种跨团队的时候，我们怎么去做到这种 thin slice？
他们
比较好处理一点。
我问一个另外问题，就是说这些其他团队，他们跟你这个系统有一起在做这个系统吗？还是说他们是不同的系统？
我想是一个，我把它定义成一个子系统吧。
好
这个只是也它没有办法直接单独交付，它还是得整合在一起才能交付。
OK，是有不同的方法可以做啊。一个方法可能是说，如果我们这个系统，我这个 team 在做那个主系统的话，或母系统，我会先把我们自己这里面的切分先搞好，然后这个子系统我们可能下一个 sprint 或什么的时候，我们再去切分它。那如果说我们这个母系统没办法直接切分的话，跟那个子系统，我们就需要想一下 ，OK， 那是不是我们这一部分，这个系统这一部分，是不是我们2个 team 都需要一起来决定说，我们这个从头到尾是要怎么切分的？那怎么做呢？这个就要看你组织咯，因为这个我不太了解你组织现在内部是像怎么样的规划，可是有方法的话，最好就是我自己啦，就是说我们可能需要做像 event storm 这样的东西，对不对？然后说 OK，那也许我们这两边共同点是有一个 data type， 一个 data object， 是两边都需要 pass 来 pass 去的。那我们如果是我们母系统到子系统这个 data type 从端到端要看起来像什么样子，我们先把那个先弄好，然后再慢慢两边再分散去开发我们的系统这样子，有可能是这样子 ，maybe， 可是需要多了解你现在的状况。
就如果我们没有办法整合，没有办法从组织上面整合的话，至少尽量沟通，让他们都至少同时，
对，至少同时，对，就是可能找一些共同点啊或什么的，就是有可能是 data type， 有可能是你的 workflow， 也有可能是说它只是 share 一个 endpoint 而已。你们中间 coupling 是在哪里？
然后我在讲的是一个我过去的一些比较在大组织的一些比较没那么好的经验。
好，
我现在组织很小，
OK， 好 OK。
还有其他问题吗？
来，
user center design，然后刚好提到有 persona 还有 machine 啊，那每个，例如说营销或者是他们的 product 或者是开发，他们彼此可能都是站在某一个点上，代表他的 machine 或者 persona。
对，
那这些在汇整这些资料的时候，或者这些意见的时候，我们怎么决定我们现在要做哪一个？因为要做事情很多，那我们怎么站在某一个点上去说服别人说，哎，我这个地方是做的是对的，所以我们接下来的 sprint 应该要执行这个项目。那每个人都认为他是对的，那这时候该做决断人是谁？因为我们 case 是 CEO，那我就确定是对的。
所以你的 CEO 大部分都会做这个决定吗？还是你们有 PM？
其实就是我们现在觉得这是不对的，我们没有 PM，可是为什么是 CEO 在做呢？
为什么你们组织应该是蛮小的，算
是
像 startup 那样子，对不对？
没错
就是创新的这些。
对，
这个很多问题，说实在很难回答，因为不同的 team 都有不同的文化。那很多 startup， 因为他们那时候刚好就是因为是新创业组织嘛，对不对？大部分的人，你 CEO 需要有一个了解，就是真的要看人，我觉得他能不能信任过你们这一些做技术的，能了解说 OK 做技术，或是我们可能有一个 designer 在那边，设计师，他目前可能跟我们客户聊的比我还多。虽然这是我自己创造，然后当时我已经我觉得我认识市场，可是那个时候跟现在市场可能已经改变了。这个的话，你可能我自己个人以前有一个经验，就是说那个时候是大组织嘛，我的总经理是要我把我的那个产品改一个方向，跟微软那边合作，他已经跟微软那边的副总已经谈好，说我们要这样子来做一个 integration， 他跟我说也要改，然后我说为什么要改？我们现在用户只有这么多，然后你要我改，我可以改，可是要花这么多钱，然后再加上我们 backend support， 还有我们的 support team， 他们又需要再增加个50到60个人才维护。 那你看，你如果要花这么多钱的话，我们可能需要这数据全部给他之后，他当然怎么样不开心啊？可是没办法，就数据都是这样子啊，你要撒这么多钱是可以撒，可是你要等个12年才会把那个钱全部都赚回来。那最后你来决定你要不要做。我不知道你现在有没有这种数据，就是说，除了你自己写一个 persona 之外，有没有一些市场的一些数据可以给他看，或者是你的 revenue， 或者是你的那个 revenue projection 现在是像什么样子？不知道你们知不知道？应该可以跳
是，可是我
查得到吧？
这个数据没让你所以我看到数据了，但是我们现在面临的问题是，我对这些数据，你能不能相信这些数据啊？是问号。我们提出一些数据，我们的看法，那可能别人就说，哎，不对啊，你这个数据呈方是这样，另外一个方式去想的时候，我可能得到的数字就不是这样。
所以看起来你们内部你的那个数据是，
例如说使用者要，例如说我们的 TA 是什么，例如说可能预期的 market share，
你有没有跟用户直接面对面谈过？拍下来，摄影记录，对，那
就会，我是觉得可能是有一些，我觉得像你这样讲，可能是 CEO 他要懂得，可能需要放权吧，因为他会去用他的经验或者是他的方式去问说，哎，你这个东西我觉得没有说服到我，但是你提出的东西。
我看 Wes 有没有想法，可是我有另外想法就是这边就是说，你 CEO 的他可能反对的点，你们有 designer 吗？还是谁去做这些面对面谈的？有 designer，他跟 designer 可能最好是做一个1对1的谈话，然后把你 CEO 不安的点列下来，然后 designer 在他面前写一些问题给你的用户，然后他去做 interview，这样子问完之后再把那个数据反馈给 CEO 看，因为也许 CEO 是对的，我们还不知道，也许他可能只对一半。那他最重要了解是什么 ？CEO 反对是在哪里？因为是他的钱嘛，对不对？他自己不安，那要先说服他的不安。那最好就是把他跟我们的使用者跟用户直接连在一起，然后他知道之后，或许他可以参加你的那个 interview 的时间，也可以试试看。你有要加的吗？
要用英文回答。
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say how to put this. So usually I see where your CEO is coming from for sure. And I think when CEOs have those questions, that's great because they're involved and like it's not really concern they're having, it's investment because it is their money, it is their product. So that's great to have. Let's try to leverage that energy to have to have a conversation, make it collaborative rather than making it kind of like a friction point. So I'd say, so in user-centered design, I mentioned doing interviews. Interviews are also for interviewing your stakeholders, both like customer stakeholders and also your organizational stakeholders. So I think the idea of having some time to have the designer or some other person on your team have a private conversation with them, like, hey, tell me where your concerns come from, instead of like asking the 5 whys, because those questions have to come from somewhere. But if you can get to the root cause of where that is, then you can get to a place where like, oh, I see what you mean. Okay. And then you come to that common understanding. And then it says, hey, thank you for your concerns. Now let me take it to the users. And you bring that evidence back to either say, yes, you were correct, or, hey, I see where you're coming from, but this is what the market is saying. And so the data becomes not a test, but like a compass. So then your CEO feels most comfortable with the direction of your product. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Thank you.